Hi, everyone. This is Heaven.
I'm Tracy.
And we're from Another Round with Heaven and Tracy.
And you are now listening to Rich and Wim on Two Guys, One Show. Hey.
What's good, everyone? You're listening to Two Guys, One Show, a fun, formative podcast covering work, money, and life from the 30-something perspective. We drop 2 shows a week, the main show where we do a deep dive on topics to help you get ahead in life, and the side episode where we cover what's top of mind, listener questions, and more. My name is Rich, and I'm here with Wisdom is Misery, a.k.a. Wim, a.k.a. Wiz, and this is side episode 22. 222s! What's going on, man?
Getting ready for the side episode, the side mixtape, although we spit on the original.
Yeah, I'm feeling pretty good today, I must say, all things considered. I'm feeling optimistic about the work week, which is kind of weird. Normally when I feel that way, something awful happens. So
that sounds about right.
So in terms of pre-show announcements, if you're not making use of Soundcloud, you can live tweet this episode using hashtag TGOSide. It's a good way to find other listeners, see what they're saying about the episode, and also connect with some people who are probably interested in similar things. And the other announcement, the first TGO live show is on the way, so we're taking our talents to video, but we're only making it available to our email list. So to get access to future live shows, you can sign up at twoguys1show.com/email. If you're hearing this and you're signing up now, you've missed a window for the upcoming live show, but you will be in the loop for ones that we do in the future as well. And our email list is also where you get other updates as it relates to show activity, other things coming up, things not happening, discounts on shirts, new digital products, all of that other good stuff. So again, twoguys1show.com/email. But other than that, I think we can jump into top of mind for this week, man. So what's top of mind on your side?
Down goes Ronda.
Yes.
Ronda Rousey, the neck kick heard around the world, lost her championship this weekend in the I think she's a bantamweight fighter at 134 and I literally had to look this up. Even though this woman just won and I have seen all of the videos, I still had to look up her name just to get ready for this show. Holly Holmes, world-class fighter, actually. 34-year-old Holly Holmes, who's been boxing for like 20 years. Buster Douglas Holmes knocked out Ronda Rousey with a leg kick to the neck. For those of you, and I don't know how you haven't by now seen the video of UFC 193. And in full disclosure, once again, this is like, I think I haven't missed a UFC fight since like a big major one since like UFC 99. And I'm like, yo, you know what? I know how this is going to end. Ronda Rousey's going to armbar in the first round. I bought one 2 fights ago. I'm not going to waste my money. I'm not even going to waste my time. We're not going to the bar. Let's just go to the club. Like, forget this. We all know the story. And we're at the club. We're doing shots of Patron, which I'm not even going to go into that story. I feel like there should be an age limit on shots of Patrons, though, and you should not be doing it on the wrong side of 30. We sadly learned yesterday.
I am slowly shaking my head at you.
Bruh. It was not good. It was not good. It was weird how it happened. It was like, and here, I mean, this, now mind you, we had been drinking. So in our heads, we did the shot and it seemed like a really long time passed before it hit everybody. And it just went downhill. Like it's almost, we weren't even like still drinking. We were chilling. We were actually playing pool. Me and the missus whooped this other couple in pool. Shout out to the missus for hitting the 8-ball in after missing every other shot.
Y'all real serious. I was going to say y'all were real serious about the pool thing.
Yo. We tried to shut it down. We're actually competitive. So we were like, I'm running the table, whatever. I was in that zone where you ever accidentally got good at something. Like I think I missed like 2 shots. Like I'm hitting it. I didn't clear the table or anything. I'm not like no pool shark. But I was like, hold it down, right? And so I get up there and the missus gets the 8-ball set up, and she was feeling the Patrons a little bit different than I was, so she was in a different zone. And I'm like, babe, don't scratch on this. But to her credit, and I got to shout out and recognize her, she hit the winning shot. Give her all praise to the missus. Anyway, so we're doing that. We're playing pool, and all of a sudden you just see everybody start looking at their phone. Like, I mean, even more than usual, beyond the social media. It's almost like something was going on in the club. Everybody starts looking at their phone. You start hearing, oh my God. We're like, what the hell? And then I got a text that says, literally, down goes Ronda. Down goes Ronda. So I text back. It's a group chat. I'm thinking, like, what? She stubbed her toe? What happened? Did she fall out the ring on accident? He's like, she is knocked the fuck out right now. So naturally, we, like everybody else in the club, had to pull up the video. It was like, it was one of those shared big social media moments where, like, everybody was doing the same thing. So yes, Ronda loses her crown. I have subsequently watched the fight on bootleg drop. I think it was on Facebook or YouTube. And I mean, it was a thorough beatdown too. It wasn't one of those where, oh, she got lucky. Oh man, Ronda hurt her wrist or hurt her leg, or like when the Spider went down when he broke his leg. No, she was thoroughly beat from the start of the bell to the TKO call of the fight.
I was going to say, I didn't see the fight, but from what I saw, looking at the still shots of that kick to the neck, like her face, I was like, wait, how did her face get fucked up like that? Was she getting her ass beat the whole fight, or did she get Chun-Li'd with the lightning kick and that neck kick was just the last part of it?
Man, she was eating punches like Cinnamon Toast Crunch from round one until she was on the mat. Like, and I saw that same thing. So the first video I saw was a Vine video. It was 7 seconds of her taking that neck kick, the infamous neck kick. And I'm like, yo, like, she looked messed up before that. Like, what's going on? I need the whole story. Like, this is crazy. Number one, like, that's a vicious way to lose. And then number two, I need to see, like, what happened before that. And now, having seen the entire video, which, I mean, the entire video is 1.5 rounds, which would make it 4 minutes.
Yeah, I was going to say
4 minutes total. And maybe even including the break between rounds. So, but yeah, she was eating punches from the start of the bell.
Yeah, that's not good. And I saw people talking about how she just hadn't trained properly, or she went into it cocky, or she'd been off filming movies and doing all this other shit. But
well, I have a different take on that. And I mean, there'll be a rematch. There has to be a rematch. I mean, there's not a clause, but like, this will be the most in-demand fight. Wouldn't even surprise me if they stretch this out for 3 fights. But in watching it, and I've seen some people, and I like Ronda, but I wouldn't like say, oh, like she is great. Don't get me wrong. But I guess I wouldn't say she's undefeatable having seen this fight take place. Before this, you like, oh yeah, she's going to armbar. She armbars everybody. But now you're looking like, can she do anything else? Like, if she doesn't get a 30-second armbar, because she looked exhausted too. So that might go into training. But in looking at the fight, like, she got outboxed. And if somebody can jab you for 3 rounds, for anybody who's ever seen somebody get jabbed for 3 rounds or has been jabbed for 3 rounds, like, that's not something you easily overcome. So I'm watching this fight and I'm like, how is she going to? So let's say there is a rematch. Like, the only thing, she's not going to learn to be a 20-year world-class boxer, and whether they fight in the next 6 months or the next 60 months. Yeah. So that's number one. Number two, if she charges her, and she did. She tried to get a submission like she always does. She couldn't submit her. Like, the girl was too strong. So I don't know if that's a fact of Ronda's training or Ronda whatever. But I guess I don't see an easy stylistic change that would have changed the outcome of this fight. Like, I'm like, oh, well, she didn't do this. Now, there's some that she wasn't very patient. But I don't think she was patient because she was frustrated because she was eating jabs for 3 minutes. Like, if you had somebody punching you in your face for 3 minutes, you tend to get impatient. As the infamous Mike Tyson said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. So you imagine doing that for 3 minutes. I guess I will be interested to see how she responds, of course, like any champion. And then number two, can she come up with a style that would allow her to overcome this particular fighting style? And it kind of reminds me of a loose analogous example is Pacquiao and Marquez, who have fought in like 5 or 7 times. Pacquiao, great fighter, but Marquez just had his card. Like, Marquez, like, his fighting style was just something Pacquiao will, and will always struggle to overcome. And I wonder if, in this example, Holly will be Ronda's Marquez. Like I can't see her dominating Holly. She might beat her because all she has to do is get her to the ground and armbar, but that's easier said than done when you're dealing with a world-class boxer who also, and I mean, she won the fight on a kick.
Yo, I was waiting to say that. I was like, it's funny to me that the world-class boxer, instead of winning with the jab or like a hook or an uppercut, wins with a kick to the neck, which is probably the last thing people would expect.
Well, that's something I thought was overlooked, and I actually even overlooked it until I saw it in slow motion, is one, she punches and bunches, which is something they always talk about. Great fighters punch in bunches. They're not one-hitter quitters. And number two, she's a mixed martial artist. She varies her attack. And I don't know what her ground game is or is not, but I know that Ronda tried to submit her at one point, and she got out of it. She got out of the infamous armbar submission that no other woman to this point has gotten out of.
Yeah, it sounds like she was actually outmatched in this case. Then,
yeah, I am interested to see fight number 2. And for whatever's worth, I am one of those folks that owe Miss Holly Holmes a complete apology. Like, I completely underestimated. I'm like, yo, I completely dismissed her record and what she brought to the ring. I was like, yo, she's going to get her ass kicked. She's going to get armbarred like everybody else. And that's that. Damn. And I was wrong.
Hungry Holly showed out.
Yes,
so I do wonder, though. So do you think that this, like, taking this loss affects her marketability and all of this other shit she has going on?
Yes and no. So there was actually an article that came out from, and I don't remember this source, but it's like one of those big sports magazines that said that Ronda had the potential to have sponsorships equal to LeBron James. So as far as volume, she might not get the volume anymore because they're going to go for number 1. But I actually think and I hate to say that there's a silver lining in getting your ass kicked, but there might be a silver lining here is now people can sponsor her like as the comeback queen. So she actually might come out on top of this still until fight number 2. And depending on the outcome of fight number 2. So I think the outcome of this next fight, which I imagine will be coming, probably might already be signed by the time we drop this podcast, will be more telling than this particular outcome. I think the world is still reeling from the result of this, just like when Tyson got beat like by Buster Douglas. That's why I jokingly said that Holly Buster Douglas Holmes. Like, I think the future will be more telling than the present.
Yeah, I was also just thinking about, I saw a quick clip of at the beginning of the fight where the referee said touch hands or whatever, and she just like walked away because she'd rather apparently she'd rather take the paws to the face instead. So now I'm wondering if for the next fight, if Holly's going to do the same thing and just not touch hands and just walk the other way. So it will be interesting. The intrigue is already there, so I can see that there's definitely going to be a lot of money made off of that.
Well, to be fair, I don't know. I literally don't know how much is Ronda the person versus Ronda the character. And that happens with fighting. I mean, the true great fighters, the true marketable fighters tend to be either equal parts character and fighter or 75% character, 25% fighter. And so, I really don't know how much, because she did talk a lot of shit. Ronda talked a lot of shit pretty much up and down the fight. She was even talking shit on Instagram before the fight. So she went on a whole national tour talking shit. And it is what it is, but how else do you promote and build up a fight? And that's another thing. This fight was pretty slept on. Most people were like, you know what, it's going to be the same old story. So I don't even think the viewership was probably as relative as I wouldn't be surprised if there was less viewers for this particular fight than usual for Ronda's fight, because most people probably thought it would go as it's always gone for her last 8 fights. I think this next one will be blockbuster.
Interesting. I can already see her going off to the WWE for a long career there, since that's like 90% character, and since she's already had some incidents on that side of things. But yeah, I may even have to tune into that next one.
To bring that full circle back to your question as far as how it will affect her marketability. What I'm interested in is how they'll market Holly, because Holly is Holly's 34. And how can I put this?
Wheaties.
Doesn't appear to traditionally define what you saw in Ronda. And I wonder if they'll market Holly, if Holly will be targeted like folks targeted Ronda. I think that will be telling as well. or will she be ignored? Like an exception, or like, oh yeah, she got lucky, which she did not. Like anyone.
But that's what I was going to say. She sounds like
Yeah.
she whooped that ass.
Yes, anyone that says that she got lucky here is like either blind, deaf, dumb, or a true so blind, deaf, and dumb Ronda fan that they can't see that Ronda just got outclassed and outbeat in this fight. It is what it is. It happens.
Yeah, I'll have to go back and watch the full 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Yo, and that's the other thing. This thought of paying like $60 to watch something go for potentially 30 seconds. I mean, of course, there's other matches on the card, but I think most people are typically tuning in, unless they're a real enthusiast about the sport, they're tuning in to see that main event. And so that's the other thing that always gets me about some of these UFC events is it's like, damn, like a match, like matches really do just end. It's like, it seems like it's common for a match to end in like 2 minutes.
You don't want to do that to yourself, brother, because didn't Mayweather make like $24 million every minute of his last fight?
Man.
So don't do that math to yourself.
Nah, I'm not going to do it. So anything else on top of mind?
One quick note for the fellas, or maybe even for the ladies who shop for the fellas or the fella in your life. Man, what the fuck y'all wearing? Like, I downloaded a couple of apps. I got TrunkClub on the phone. I got Guilt, and
TrunkClub sounds hood.
It's actually very nice. It's actually probably too nice. And this happened in the Black Box discussion. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Black Box conversation, those conversations we have in prepping for the show that we're either going to release for the platinum members or take to our graves. We have not decided yet. And I was saying, so TrunkClub, they actually allegedly, I mean, it's just a picture, and you know how catfish goes.
Yeah.
It's a picture, and it's like, this is your personal stylist, and tell her you fill out a survey of clothes and where you shop, and allegedly your personal stylist picks out clothes for you. You can allegedly call and talk to her. Coincidentally, it happens to be her. I don't know if it's her all the time. And I got an email from my personal stylist. She's like, hey, let's set something up so we can discuss what to get. And I'm like, is she trying to get me killed? Like,
yeah, my first thought, that was my very first thought. I was like, ooh, so you got like,
yes. So I got this little like Google Plus image of this little woman like, hey, let me help me dress you. And I'm like, hey, I ain't signed up for this. So that being said, I'm going to talk to the missus about how this TrunkClub app works. But on another note, and because I don't want to, have these types of conversations, I'm asking the listeners, like, what are y'all using? I'm trying to, I wouldn't say step up, but I'm trying to do something different with my dress game. Trying to dress
step up.
Yeah, I just didn't want to do that.
Yeah.
That was my ego trying to draw a pause there. But like, what are y'all using? Where are y'all shopping? What apps? And I'm not even really an online shopper. I like to go in the store. I like to put the clothes on. I like to get the deals. And I usually like to go to the clearance rack. And that's probably half the problem. So I'm trying to see what fiscally responsible places y'all shop at to dress like a person on the wrong side of 30, but in a nice way.
Yo, this TrunkClub site is, it's exactly the opposite of what I thought it was. Of course, this was without me hearing your explanation of what it is.
To give a frame of reference, so I logged in, I did my little survey. You fill out a survey of where you shop, your dress style. There's like pictures, and they're like, okay, which one of these do you like? Why?
The most basic one.
Colors do you like? Why? Are you bold, casual, or whatever? What do you wear for work? And then, this allegedly, like I said, this could all be a catfish. I might just be handing over my credit card to a bunch of fraudsters in some nefarious country. That being said, allegedly, then they hook you up with a personal stylist who will then send you a trunk, which is why they call it TrunkClub. You try it out for 10 days, and then whatever you want to keep, you pay for. Whatever you don't want to keep, you send back. Allegedly.
Yo, this is kind of crazy. I almost want to try it.
I logged in, and the first thing I saw was like $138, so I logged back out.
Well, this does look premium too. So I'm looking at the site and I'm like, all right, this looks like it's not cheap at all. And it seems like there's a certain level of clientele that they're looking for. But I would at least log in, even just to go through the process of like determining what my style is, because I'm sure it's like the most basic thing there. Like if there's a picture of a caveman, that's probably me.
I am intrigued, and if you've used TrunkClub, Guilt, or a similar app, or any app, please write in, let me know as I struggle through this transition.
Yeah, man. And so this is super timely because I think I mentioned briefly on a previous episode that I was in a little bit of a conversation, I'll call it, with Boobokins over my shirt selection. because I have a couple shirts that have been with me for a number of years that she says don't look flattering. But yo, I love the fucking shirts. I mean, they're comfortable. I feel like they look good when I look in the mirror, but she doesn't think that. So I'm starting to look at other options, things I can do to freshen up the game a bit. So I'll look into this, and we'll also be curious what the listeners have to say, and in terms of where I can find other basic shirts that still look dressy enough to be appropriate for boobokins. Actually, I wonder if there's like a site like you can go to that says, "Will my girl like this?" And you just put in like some preferences, some basic information about her, and someone tells you like she'll think that shit is ugly, she'll think that shit is dope, that'll get you buns. I'm sure something like that probably exists, and if it doesn't, it's in the work, and I will happily take a royalty for the idea.
You know, we get yelled at this almost weekly for these apps we give away, but I also have one because looking at TrunkClub, I was like, okay, I like the app, I like the idea, I like the concept, but what I thought would be really cool if there was like a Tinder for personal stylists. It's like, yo, I'm going to the mall this weekend, swipe left, swipe right. You find you're like your stylist is on there. She's like, here's my experience. Oh, man or woman, let me be fair. He or she, here's my experience. Here's people I've dressed. Here's an example of the closet that I use, swipe right. And then you meet with your personal stylist at the mall. Like, I would like for somebody to go to the mall and like, who is knowledgeable in fashion.
This is genius.
Man.
Yo, this is now
edit this out. Edit this all out.
This is now the $1 Million podcast. Because we're giving away $1 million ideas. I'm sitting here like, yo, that's fucking awesome. I would love that. It's because I think about the times that I'm like frustrated and like or an event comes up and I got nothing to wear and maybe Boobokins isn't available. Like, this is genius.
Mobile style.
Man, that's the wave.
MS.
Yeah. Anything else on this front?
Other than I just gave away my $1 billion idea. That's all I got.
All right, cool. So on my side, a bit more somber. So I think by now, well, definitely by the time this episode comes out, everyone will have heard about the terrorist attacks that took place in France. So our thoughts and prayers are with, I know that we have a few French listeners, so I hope that they're well. I know I got a couple of people that I need to add on Twitter and make sure they're good, but definitely thoughts and prayers there. And then the other thing that's been going on, and this will come up in a subsequent discussion, is the race-related tensions that have been happening at the University of Missouri. So there's been several events that have happened there over the past few months, a number of protests, the president of the university system stepping down. So a lot of tensions there. I'm assuming that a lot of people who've listened to this show are very much aware of what's happening there. So not going to run through the full list of events, but paying attention to that as well. And it seems like this past week was a particularly crazy one for horrible news. Like I think I read last night that there was even like a mass college shooting that took place in Kenya. And so it's like all of these things are happening within a 3 or 4 day period. And I'm finding myself in that weird phase where like, I don't want to look at the news, but it doesn't mean that I don't care. It's just that every time I go to CNN.com, I just get depressed. So I'm not sure if you've noticed all of this stuff that's been, I'm sure you probably heard of the things that are happening, but you're seeing the same trend where every time you go to these sites, it's just like, I can't look at this. Like, I don't want to ignore what's going on in the world, but there's a mental toll to seeing some of these images and reading these types of stories.
Yes. Well, I guess first and foremost, thoughts and prayers with those in Paris, France. There was also an attack in Lebanon that got less coverage because of I'm not having a comparison Olympics over here because of the issues that were going on in France. So thoughts and prayers to any listeners that are affected by that. Mizzou as well over back in the States. Anyone that is directly or indirectly impacted by those issues, well, thoughts and prayers out to those. So I guess I would open with that. And you know, and it's probably because I just have a probably flawed, overly analytical way of looking at things, but I struggle with this pretty much every time is, are the things worse or are we more knowledgeable of? And I have to caution and would even have to caution myself and even have to, and I guess even have a little something I can bring up right there. Myself and others that, okay, are things worse or am I more knowledgeable of the things that are going on? And by most indications, it seems to be the latter. We have more access to more information than ever and quicker. And I would think a lot of folks in these countries would say that, like, these unfortunately bad things happen all the time over here. It's nice that you folks across the pond are acknowledging it, but this is our life, especially in some other countries, probably beyond the border of France. But I would say France inclusive of, like, they're like, these are issues we deal with. And, and I even being one, the typical American, a lot of time I'm unfamiliar with a lot of this information because I'm not privy to it. It's not shared with us until it affects our borders. And then, so there's just something that I try to find that balance as I work through emotionally and maybe even mentally all the things that are taking place and that I am now aware of in myself and others. And yeah, I mean, with all that being said, it did seem to be a particularly bad week and or month, because I think the South Africa incident you're referring to was actually last week. It definitely appears bad right now.
Yeah. So we're definitely thoughtful of all of that. So thoughts and prayers are definitely out there. So we want to do something a little bit different on this side episode and kind of have a main topic of discussion. And Leora, who's been helping us out behind the scenes with some of the show stuff, linked us to an article called The Coddling of the American Mind, which ran on The Atlantic. And if you've read articles on The Atlantic, you know that they are not short. So we'll definitely link to it in the show notes, but you'll probably need to have a good 15 minutes on your hand, or maybe I'm just like a really slow reader. I feel like I read it in like 4 different time segments. Like I read part of it, went and did something, came back and read some more, went and did something else, then came back. It was like reading a book.
I also am knowingly a slow reader, and but even with that recognition, it was still, in my opinion, a very long article, and therefore, and also it was intriguing because I had to pause throughout the article. I'm like, let me give some thought to that. It wasn't one of those things where, let me just read through this and I'm gonna move on, to the next tweet. It was a thought-provoking piece for me anyway.
Yeah. And so if I had to summarize it, it was really about this idea of us being in this increasingly thin-skinned PC era where everything is offensive and everything requires a trigger warning. And we're trying, and in particular in academic institutions, they're trying so hard to not offend people that it's making it more difficult for universities to teach people how to think, as opposed to teaching people to accept and to be cautious and to walk on eggshells at all times. So that's kind of how I would summarize it. There was a lot in this article. So as Wiz was just saying, where I had a lot of moments where I had to stop and I was trying to copy and make notes. And then I was like, I feel like I'm back in school and I'm preparing to write like a 10-page essay for my final exam or some shit like that. But there was a lot to think about, both in terms of my individual experience, what the authors were saying in terms of this piece, in terms of what the school system is today, how this hypersensitive PC era is translating into social media. So one thing I read that was also interesting is that the first generation to grow up with Facebook, I think, is either just starting college or is graduating from college, and how that generation is so used to the online media landscape and the norms that come with that. So mobilizing against anyone that offends you and stuff like that. And I had
let me jump in a little bit right there, because I also thought that was interesting, and I want to give people a little bit more nuance. So that'll translate. So if I don't have the years in front of me, so you might want to correct me on that, but I believe he said in 2006, Facebook started, and they allowed 13-year-olds on the website the next year. And then based on that, that means the first wave of middle school all the way through college, they would have gone to college in 2011, and they would be graduating this year. Yeah. So I'm just giving people some years to work from. So they're like, okay, that didn't, I don't believe that or whatever. Whether you believe it or not, 2006, then 2011, those people were entering college, and now they're graduating. And that's why this article was covering, in this guy's opinion, and we'll talk about whether we agree and disagree with, the issues that have occurred because of that. And not just Facebook, but with Facebook being the largest social media presence that most people know and are aware of.
Yeah, yeah. And the one thing I would point out, because someone will write in about this, Facebook itself started when I was in school, and that's when it was limited to a select number of universities. So that puts it at probably 2004, and then 13-year-olds or younger people being allowed on the platform in 2006, and then the rest of that being completely accurate. So the first thing that I really wanted to think about is, is the American school system failing to instill critical thinking skills by kind of acquiescing and accepting this hypersensitive / PC era?
So throughout this piece, so let me cover the article title, at least so folks know where we're working from. Maybe you can pause, go read the article, and then come back and we'll walk through this conversation. So it's The Coddling of the American Mind. We'll have it linked to in the show notes. And the tagline or byline is, in the name of emotional well-being, college students are increasingly demanding protection from words and ideas they don't like. Here's why that's disastrous for education and mental health. So that's, even if you don't read the piece, at least that's where we're starting from, so you could know where we're working from. And then I also Googled, Facebook was founded in 2004. And you are right, it was not open to the public at that time. I had to take a trip down memory lane about that.
I only know because it was open to my school early on. Otherwise, I'd have been like, 2006, sure. Makes sense to me.
I actually had to get off Facebook, but that's not about me. It's not about me. So my short answer is yes. And then I actually have a lot of, I'm going to disclaim, cautionary.
See, it's that PC era.
Yeah. And I have these periods, and people probably hear this throughout the show, and I think they can relate to it, is I would broadly say this piece was mostly about millennials, although I think it covers a period longer than the millennials. And I don't know what actually the next generation is called. I actually think they're called like Z or some shit. So it loosely refers to millennials. And there's a lot of times where like I am both annoyed by millennials, offended on behalf of millennials, and then also have to recognize I am a millennial by most standards.
I was
like
thinking
that. Yeah, there's some that find me as X, but I'm like right on that weird year cutoff. I'm like 82. So some people are like, oh yeah, you're a millennial. Some people are like, okay, you're an X. But with that being said, I don't want to be, there was parts of this article, and we'll probably walk through this a little bit, where I felt it was being overly dismissive. And you'll know when Leora wrote out to us to go read this piece, and I appreciate her for doing it because it was a very interesting piece. I wrote back, having not read this, when we talk about safe spaces and what does or does not need to happen, I think a lot of times, and I actually think this author would fall into this group, is it comes from people who are knowingly, passively, or actively in a privileged position. And I'll define that as usually older, richer, not necessarily rich, but richer, and frankly, white males. And they're like, you know what? I'm annoyed by everybody telling me what to do, so let me tell them what to do. And I'm like, that's not how any of this works. So it's usually this privileged person talking about, you know what, we're being too nice and too coddling. And that's coming from somebody who said, I'm annoyed by these trophy participation as generation. So I think there's a balance to be found. And you're right. Is that because I'm biased, blinded, or partial to my own byproduct of being a participation generation person?
Yeah.
Even though I hate participation trophies. So, I mean, there's several nuances, I think, that have to be walked through as we have this discussion. And I even wrote down some terms here while I was thinking about it when I was reading it, and even as you were kind of giving the prep speech here, your stump speech. And I'll walk through these, but just the ones I wrote down was safe space, which was almost kind of a new term for me. I didn't even realize this was going on, but it made more sense after reading the article and a lot of things that have been happening recently. Like, for example, if you were on Twitter and probably Facebook, although Facebook tends to be late to the party for a lot of things, you're like the drunk person that shows up to the party drunk already. Causing a ruckus, and they're like, hey man, put on this song that was just on 15 minutes ago had I shown up on time. That feels like Facebook sometimes. They show up late and they want to hear the playlist that everybody else has already heard. So
well done.
And that is Safe Space. We literally had a podcast about microaggression, offensive for the sake of being offended, and what do we call it? Hashtag fake hate, hashtag fake mad.
Fake mad.
And
fake outrage.
Yeah, and he pointed out that offensiveness is in itself objective, or subjective, excuse me, and people treat it as if it's objective. The PC Nation and victim blaming. And those were like buzzwords, some of which came up literally in the article and some of which I was reminded of, because they're things that I see a lot. I've used myself and perhaps struggle on both sides of the fence on, okay, is this truly a victim issue, or is this a victim blaming issue? Are we addressing the issue? Are we addressing the root cause? Or are we being completely dismissive?
I think it is a combination. So for one, I do think that we're in this hypersensitive era where anything like you can't even voice your opinion nowadays on certain things without having to do all of these qualifying statements, and you risk alienating the world. And you know that if you do say something, the article gets into this too. If you do say certain things, that you're going to deal with a backlash, even though you're coming from a good place, but what you're saying, but because it's a contrary opinion and somebody finds it offensive, you're in the wrong for voicing that. So I only
want to jump in because I was literally writing down, it's scary to have an opinion. Like right while you were saying that, I was writing down, it's scary to have an opinion.
It is. And we'll get more into this, but I also think it plays into what we've been saying about sites like Twitter. And, there was the article about, Twitter dying and stuff like that, and why some of us are less apt to have discussions online than we were 1, 2, 3 years ago, because everything has a hypersensitive reaction and everything has some type of inherent risk to it. And most of us don't want to deal with it, and I think that part of that is a product of the era that we're in. So yes, I definitely think that critical thinking skills are being impacted, and in some ways, kids are being these days. And I'm sounding like the super washed person. Oh, these kids coming up these days, they're not getting the education that we got. And I'm thinking about even my own school experience, and that was 2001 to 2005, and I don't feel that it was even close to as sensitive as it is to what's happening now with these type of conversations. I mean, I remember having classes where we had debates, things were said where people were offended, but if something was offensive, even if a professor said something that was slightly offensive, I guess there wasn't the vehicle then for that to then turn into a movement to get that professor out of their job, so there's a lot of differences there, but I think you may have been going somewhere else, but that was top of mind.
No, I agree. And I want to also highlight that other article because I think it's interesting relative to this, and it's called Why Twitter's Dying and What You Can Learn from It. And that's on medium.com. And it's by, I'm not going to pronounce his name correctly, so I'm not going to say who it's by, but I will link to it in the show notes. And because he touched on something I observed, but I attributed to a different issue. And that is, I agree. And I even think the numbers show that Twitter is dying, although it's still successful. Like it's adding members, but it's not adding nearly as many members as it used to. And some in the industry are saying that it's like reached max capacity. Like it's going to stagnate sooner rather than later. And I think, so in that Why Twitter's Dying article, he attributed a lot of that to the abuse on the platform, which I think does exist. There's a lot of abuse on Twitter, but I almost think that's like blaming thunder because lightning happened. Like there's a lot of abuse on the internet, and I feel like Twitter is just a vehicle to express abuse that happens on the internet. And I feel like he placed a lot of blame on Twitter for not alleviating abuse on the internet. And no one has been able to alleviate abuse on the internet because the internet is abusive. And he also pointed out that a lot of, and I have seen this, and it's frustrating, it's annoying, but I also had a conversation with one of our followers around this, and that Twitter has become a lot more cliquey. You've got a clique of news journalists. You've got a clique of social activists. You've got a clique of users that just want to have fun. You've got all these different cliques and niches, and that's true, but Twitter's about in its 7th year. And I kind of use the metaphor, it's like high school. And we talked about this in the last podcast. People click up naturally. Yeah. And I can't blame Twitter for being representative of the public. So in some ways, in demonizing Twitter, we're actually demonizing ourselves, because there was like an SNL skit or some joke where they designed the internet and they're like, hey, let's send out the first message. Okay, now that that's done, let's find some porn on this thing. And it's like, like that's what the internet does. I remember when, what was that website that came out? Chat Roulette. Chat Roulette was cool for 15 minutes because it was people. Do you remember Chat Roulette? Do I need to go into the whole concept of Chat Roulette?
It sounds like it gets really dicey. Well, what a short
That's
answer.
the thing.
What a short answer is no. I haven't heard of it, and I don't know what.
Okay,
it is.
what it was is this dates me by because it was before Twitter, and I think it was around MySpace. But it was like when webcams were really big. Like webcams were were always big, but they were like getting all digital and everything. And you go into Chat Roulette, and you would roulette. It would spin, and it would just stop, and you would be connected to a webcam somewhere in the world.
Oh gosh, yo,
Yes.
that's like Periscope before Periscope.
Yes. And
Wow.
It was cool for about 1 week, if we're being serious. It was people like you could discuss, you'd meet random strangers anywhere in the world. It connected you anywhere in the world. I'm pretty sure it still exists. And then after about 72 hours, all it was men sitting with their dicks out, waiting for a woman, or I guess anyone, to land on them. Like it just became this like purveyor of everything bad. And it was just, and I was like, it's crazy to me that broadly the internet, but specifically these different websites, Twitter, Facebook, social media, it doesn't really matter. There's so much potential for greatness, and yet people ruin it. And there's another quote that says, I liked people until I got to know people. Like everything that is wrong with these quote unquote websites is people on the websites. And then we are like, oh, Twitter needs to do this and fix that to fix the human fucking condition. And I'm like, best of luck. And so that's why I try to be sympathetic to, okay, tying this back to the coddling of the American mind. Whether we realize it or not, what we're attributing as issues is we're saying that people are fundamentally flawed, and people, therefore, society is fundamentally moving in the wrong direction. And as I think you were recognizing there, I feel like we have to be cautionary in making such a sweeping generalization, because what happens every single time is every older generation becomes the back in my day.
Yeah.
The world's going to hell. Like, look at these kids. Everything's going to go over the world. Everything's going to fall off and the world will end because these younger people. But that's the consistent cycle. And while that might inevitably be true one day, it hasn't been true yet.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the thing with us being on that cusp, we are also part of that generation. So it's like, it's weird because we're like back in my day, and it's like still our day, but it seems like it was a lot further back than it was. But it does seem like there's an ongoing trend, whether it's for better or for worse, in terms of what this article is talking about with a kind of the Twitter, well, whether it's Twitter policing or it's Facebook policing or, it's university policing, and not in the crime sort of way, but someone says something, it's offensive, and there has to be an immediate response to it. It feels like as time goes on, in some ways, we are devolving as a society, while at the same time making these tremendous progress or having this tremendous progress in terms of technologies and other inventions that are supposed to make life easier. So it's like there's progress happening at the same time, but then it also feels like in some ways that we're taking a step back at the same time. But the core thing, like you said, that's involved, no matter how you look at it, is humans. Humans take steps forward and they take steps back. Things change and people adapt in even different social norms. And I know even with what this article was talking about how eventually if this hypersensitivity continues, then people who are born, they're going to grow up being hypersensitive to everything because they're not going to know anything different. Whereas our generation, well, those of us who were on the earlier side of the millennial side of things and those who came before us, they're going to be looking even more intently at these future generations and saying, what the fuck happened? Like, we used to be able to have a conversation, and we used to be able to have differing opinions, and that didn't mean that we were offending someone. It just meant that we weren't on the same page.
Yeah, and we talked a little, or we touched on this a little bit when we did the participation trophy conversation, which actually we pretty much aligned on. But I gave, room for that psychologist's response as well as, okay, we had all these competitive generations, loosely termed, and now we have this participation trophy generation. And when you look at the two, the competitive generation didn't fix anything. Like, we still had the banking collapse. We still had wars. We still had fights. We still had crime. And so let's give this quote unquote softer generation a chance, because in some areas of this article, I was reminded of the proverb of the old coach, coach, I broke my leg, walk it off, son. It kind of it felt like no matter how potentially negative, sensitive, or cautious the topic was, he kind of came across as, he was very sophisticated and smart, but I've had sophisticated, very smart, intelligent people say stupid stuff. And sometimes it kind of seemed like he was just being dismissive of the issue. And the example I felt argued both sides of the fence, and this happens all the time, where he used the classic literature example. And then, people will be familiar with this conversation of, do you view classic literature through the window of when it was delivered, or do you continue to evolve and you interpret classic literature based on the current standards of ethics, morals, et cetera, and what society expectations are? Because if you do the latter, classic literature will also always become increasingly more offensive, because we continue to evolve. And another thing that was completely dismissed in this article, which goes back to the arguing both sides of the fence, is who defined classic literature? It traditionally, historically, and almost to present, tends to be old, richer, well-off white guys. Like, when we talk about classic literature, it's usually a minority of representation of all the folks that are forced to read what they have defined as classic literature. And so then you say people are now offended by what I tell them is classic literature. Who originally made that decision? It wasn't people that looked like us who wouldn't be offended by this. And they mad that decision centuries, decades, and years ago. So these really smart, intelligent, classicalist, or whatever they're called, modernist, read this information. They say, we shouldn't be offended by the use of the N-word. We shouldn't be offended by misogynists. We shouldn't be offended by classism, because that's how it was back in the day. Well, it's not like that anymore. So I think there also needs to be an equal discussion around, do we need to does this still need to be taught? And I felt like that was dismissed a lot. He's like, it's classical because I said it's classical, or someone said it's classical. But does that someone look like the people who's offended? And 9 times out of 10, if not 10 times out of 10, if not 11 times out of 10, the answer is going to be no.
Yeah. And so this part, and I had this as one of the later points to talk about, is where we draw the line with some of this stuff. So there's the shit that's blatantly racist. I don't think that suddenly classrooms need to be just aggressively using the N-word to make a point, or just being like, back in the day when black people were known as niggers, like they don't need to start saying that in articles, because that's clearly offensive. But if there's a book, and I don't know, like the Catcher in the Rye or The Great Gatsby, or some other book that I read when I was in elementary school or even in high school, and there were some things in there that weren't the most savory, I didn't have the reaction. And of course, that's just me, and I don't represent everyone, but I individually didn't have the reaction that even if something was uncomfortable, that now this is offensive and this should be removed from the curriculum because it makes me feel some type of way. And so it's like, where do we draw that line then? Because some of the things that you're pointing out about the article, to me, I read that and I was like, that's a pretty good example, but I hadn't thought about what you said in terms of the people who were determining what's considered classic and what's not. But this argument could be made for anything. And even for this show, I remember a bunch of episodes back where I talked about a situation that played out on Twitter, and people classified our episode as misogynistic and offensive when we were just having a discussion the way that we were having now. So it's like, how do you draw the line between what's offensive and what's requiring critical thinking skills and is ultimately going to lead to a better outcome, whether that outcome is people having a perspective they didn't have before, or people being able to reach a decision or make a decision that they weren't capable of without hearing this diversity of opinion. Like how do you draw that line?
Well, and in some ways, not that I'm the only one that does this, this is what I have to do as a profession. And part of the issue is, if everyone could agree, then you wouldn't need my job. You wouldn't need lawyers. You wouldn't need judges. You wouldn't need mediators. You wouldn't need people to define consensus or disagreement. You wouldn't even really need a democracy, because what most people are doing, whether they realize it or not. So the answer I was going to say is, the reason that folks can't define that line is because that quote unquote line does not exist. And it's actually that people try to say there is a line that is usually half the issue, if not 90% of the issue. They're like, there's a line, and that line is what I define it as. Mm-hmm. And he did touch on something in the article that I did think of was of interest, although it was based in psychology, which there's nothing wrong with that. But that in itself, we have a habit, especially intellectual people or intelligent people, or even they don't even need to fall into those categories, slightly less or more than dumb people, where I'm going to interpret a difficult subject logically and intellectually, and therefore everyone will agree with my final conclusion. And that rarely, if ever, happens. And he touched on something that says, there's like a testament or tantamount of psychology that feelings, because I feel it, is therefore fact. And he had mentioned something in there, I wish I had wrote it down, that people's perception of life is actually not even accurate. It's interpreted by three things. And it was like feelings, past bias, and current viewpoints, or something to that effect. Mm-hmm. And that's the issue. And I talked I've talked to any number of people about this. You just look at social media, but look at anything. Look at any news story. Even a live event, people can experience the exact same event. And if you ask three people what happened, they'll give you three versions of that event. And all three of them will swear up and down that's what happened. Yeah. And there'll even be, and the reason I brought up social media is when these videos drop of usually incidences that you would think all generally agree are wrong, we all don't generally agree. I'm trying to think of an example that, again, you got to dance this line between bringing up examples without, I wrote down, how can you have an opinion? How can I deliver my opinion in a way that will offend no one?
There's no way to do that. Which
is a very high bar to reach. And that's kind of the society that we're operating in now. But I'll just use the video of, just because most folks are familiar with it, is the Ray Rice incident. So the Ray Rice incident, for those who aren't familiar, I don't think he's been back in the league, former football player, hit his wife so hard in the elevator on tape that she was knocked out. He dragged her out of the elevator, and that was in the tape. He got released from the league because of it. It was on TMZ. And now his wife. Some people looked at that video and universally said there is nothing that could be explained that would make what happened there right. And there was people who looked at that exact same video, and their takeaway was, I wonder what she did to deserve it. And that's the point I'm trying to make. Like, people see the exact same event and land on completely opposite spectrums. And yet we want to draw a line that will somehow define this the map, pathway, or intellectual, logical process where people will all get to the same place. And that is impossible, or at best implausible, and probably somewhere closer to low probability.
Yeah. I mean, I don't see it happening. Just with, I mean, and then in the situations where somebody does end up trying to please everyone, their message, like their true opinion ends up getting watered down and potentially watered out, which is the other side of this is if you are trying to phrase things in such a way that they're palatable to everyone, you end up losing that diversity of opinion, and you end up kind of losing yourself and your opinion in the process because you're trying so hard to walk on eggshells. And I felt like that's where the other side of this article was coming from, where it's like, if we're going to be in this generation where everything has the ability to be offensive and everyone tries to not offend, they end up not offering anything new because they're just offering what everyone else is thinking. Now, of course, I can't tie this to the Ray Rice example, but I think it does speak to the question of how do I not offend people? Like there really isn't a way. And then if you do want to try to go that way, you're going to end up losing the real opinion that you had, which goes back to this idea of our critical thinking skills being fucked up by this era of hypersensitivity or paper thin skinnedness.
Right. And a couple other things. It's almost, although I kind of see where he's going with the story, it's almost hypocritical in some ways to say that we want to teach students to think critically, but not allow them to be sensitive along the way. Because you're really saying we want to teach students how to think critically in the exact way that we want them to think. Because maybe students are thinking critically. They're just have a greater capacity for how they arrive at those conclusions. Because it's part of the issue is it depends what factors are of importance to you. And one example of that is, as I said earlier, every generation thinks the previous generation or the younger generation is worse than them and they're just going off the rails. But when you look at traditional or potentially traditional measures that could be used for that, okay, what are you going to look at? If you look at crime rates, crime's down. If you're going to look at violent crimes, pretty much every crime is down. But if you want to look at income is worse. But that's usually not what they're talking about. Our wages have stagnated since like 1989. But when older people are saying this generation's lost, and like nowhere in this article was income mentioned. So it's like, what variables are important to you in determining if a society is getting better or worse? And the one that he mentioned was the mental capacity for depression, and I forgot what the other one was. He said there's more depressed people, but there is more things to be depressed about.
Well, there are, especially with the internet. Especially, I mean, that's a big. Even what I said about going on CNN.com, like that wasn't always an option to have information that readily available. And so go ahead.
Sorry, you just reminded me. There was a comedian that tweeted yesterday, but it was a real tweet. Back in my day, you got one chance to see a music video. And you were lucky if it was the video you wanted to see. And like, that's how it was for news at one point. Like you got the newspaper and you got the 7 o'clock news. And if you missed the newspaper and the 7 o'clock news, your ass didn't get the news that day.
Yeah.
And like that is not the case anymore. So to try to interpret things from a perspective of how it was when the only constant is change, yet you don't want to refine how you're interpreting the news criteria with that change that has evolved literally every second since you made your decision on this is how it should be. That's an issue. That's a huge issue that needs to be overcome. And then particular to this specific incident, and we come across this probably more often at my job, and I don't know if I'll come across it at my new job as much, where we called it like the ivory towers. You probably heard this as well, like those guys in the ivory towers. Academia is pretty well known for driving towards this idealistic, altruistic vision of the world with no given consideration to how things actually happen in practice and reality, like the whole justice is blind, but justice is implemented by men and women. And they see in a lot of bias. So in this idea that we've already set this system up to fail with the particular solution that he provided, because every school system is different. Like, this country sets up school systems to institute whatever system they think is correct. And even within those parameters, that is then taught by professors, men and women. So you set up this framework for, here's how we're going to teach at this university or other. And then you entrust that to a professor. So it's like the phone game. You got this mission statement, you got this vision statement, and then it's the telephone game for how everyone interprets that. And it's just like I gave in the earlier example. You can read the exact same sentence and two people will walk away with two different conclusions, unless that sentence is 1 + 1 = 2.
Yeah. And so even in a situation where if you have three people who interpret it three different ways, and the one person, so if one of those three people finds it offensive, whatever that thing is, does that then mean the other two people are wrong? Or does that then mean that this particular thing, and I know this is starting to get abstract, it's starting to get real academic. Does that mean that because one person in that group was offended, that whoever the person is who shared the information or created the production that offended someone should no longer do that thing? Or now, because of that one person, do they need to tailor it for all future audiences, if that makes sense? I feel like I kept it together in general enough for that to still make sense.
Well, I think he spoke a little bit about that in the piece. And I do agree with him that part of the issue these days is there's less room for varied opinion. So to answer your question, I would say in most scenarios, the problem or part of the issue is that people aren't really wrong. They just have different perspectives.
Right.
And just because they've actually done a study like this where they did a study where they had a student randomly come in from the hallway. I think I told you about this. And there was 3 lines on the board, or it might have been 20 lines. There was a number of lines on the board, and all of the lines were equal except for one that was clearly longer or taller or shorter or whatever than the other lines. You bring in somebody randomly from outside and you say, hey, where's the shortest or longest line? And because it's obvious, at first they would say, oh, it's this one. And they had the entire classroom yell at that person like, what the hell are you talking about? All the lines are equal. Everything here, or whatever the inverse of what the person gave. And 9 out of 10 times people cave to pressure. And so I bring that up because in the scenario where there's 3 people, just because 2 people have a shared opinion, those 2 people can be equally wrong in their shared opinion. And actually the minority might be right. And there's the whole concept behind the silent majority. The people who tend to, frankly, bitch the most aren't necessarily representative of the majority.
I feel like that's usually the case.
Yeah, they tend to be the squeaky wheel, and there's reasons for that, for any other number of issues. But I do think something that was mentioned in the article that I do think is a growing problem that I have no solution for, and I'm not particularly worried about finding one, is he mentioned that students or young people in general, and maybe this has always been the case, tend to be or appear to be more dismissive of what older or even in a hierarchy of experience, or this is the professor and I'm the student, has to teach me, and they dismiss it, that this person can't teach me anything. I know everything. I have the internet.
Yeah,
so there's nothing I can learn. Yeah, there's nothing I can learn from this professor, or there's nothing I can learn from this conversation, because I'll just get on the internet and I will use my bias to find a number of facts and stories that prove what I already wanted to believe. Like, I feel like there's a cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance being that it's harder and people don't want to accept new information that disprove what they already believe. And they're more readily willing to accept information that does prove what they believe. And the internet sets it up where cognitive dissonance can be greatly extrapolated exponentially. Because it's like, look, I found all these news stories that support what I already believe, but they all came from websites or blogs that are leaning in the direction of where you already believe. And you dismissed all this other information that proves that wrong, right, or indifferent. And I do think that's a growing issue. And I like I said, I don't know how to overcome that. And I do think that will get worse, where we do have a society where people not only have their own bias, but they have access to information to further entrench and prove their bias by simply going to sources where other people are going, back to the niches of Twitter. But in some ways, it sounds like we're trying to control for people. And that has routinely failed in, I think, every scenario across every society. Now, what that means for us, whether we're going to fall like Rome or whatever the case may be, or the Mayan calendar was a few years off, whatever that the outcome of that, that's different from, well, Twitter's broken or the school system's broken. You know what I mean? There might be things that need to be alleviated, fixed. And we definitely got some fucking issues. Don't get me wrong. Our school system's all kinds of screwed. But what was it? Chamberlain? I forget his first name. The folks from across the pond will say. But, it's the best, worst system that we have available. And speaking about democracy in that particular instance.
Oh, I thought it was talking about the education system.
Oh, I'm talking about education. This example that quote
using...
comes. Yes, he was talking about democracy when in reference to communism. But you can use it and apply it to any number of metaphors or scenarios. Like, our system is screwed, but what's the better system? And even if there was a better system, would it be implemented here across the board? And if not, what have you really alleviated?
Yeah. It's, I don't know, man. It's interesting to me. Well, actually, there were a couple of other things I wanted to get into that I was about to go down a whole different ladder. But there's a couple of things that were mentioned. So there was this idea of the safe space that we talked about up front, and then also this idea of the rise in trigger warnings, which is definitely something that I've noticed. I think when I was in school, I don't think I ever heard anyone say trigger warning. And maybe that's because I wasn't in the right circles or I was too insensitive, but it didn't seem like you had to, before you said anything that might remotely be considered offensive, you had to give people a heads up about it. And now, of course, there are things where I think it makes sense. And of course, that's my opinion. So when, something is dealing with something heavily traumatic, like rape or gruesome images of murder and stuff like that, there are things like that where, to me, I'm like, okay, that makes sense. Like these are things where they could really trigger a serious reaction in somebody who was a victim of that, similar to what somebody with PTSD would have. And I know he mentioned that in the article. But then there's also this other idea of the safe space, and if that's what college campuses should be. So let's say that there are students who are coming there who think that they can learn something, but they feel like this is supposed to be a place where they're safe and insulated from things that they may find harmful for whatever reason. And there was an example that I pulled from the article, and it's like on that kind of like hypersensitivity spectrum. And the author said last year at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota, an event called Hump Day, which would have allowed people to pet a camel, was abruptly canceled. Students had created a Facebook group where they protested the event for animal cruelty, for being a waste of money, and for being insensitive to people from the Middle East. Now, I know what Hump Day comes from, or at least I thought I did from the series of commercials, and I'm sure that when this event was being put on, it was probably coming from a good place versus a party. So here's something to me that's blatantly offensive: a blackface party. And we've heard numerous stories over the years about fraternities and different organizations on campus, just for whatever reason, not understanding that it's not okay to come in blackface or to do a hip hop party and do blackface and do stereotypical images of black people versus something like Hump Day, where it seems innocuous enough on the surface, but there is one group of people that may find it offensive, so they don't feel safe. So it's like, how do you, I mean, to me, I guess I don't see college as much as a safe place to be insulated from kind of what's going on in the world or contrary opinion, as much as I see it as it should be a safe place to be able to voice your opinion respectfully. And even that is subjective, but to be able to voice your opinion subjectively on topics without fear or without worrying about the repercussions because your opinion may not be in line with everyone else in the in the room. So like, you know, even if I had voiced my opinion, you know, so if I said, so students say that the hump day thing is offensive, whatever, and I'm like, well, actually it's based on this commercial that has been going on. And it's like an ongoing joke. Like there's no racial element to it at all, at least from how I understand it and from where it originates. And then someone says, well, we feel that way, so your opinion is wrong and you're siding with them, which means that you are now offensive and we don't feel safe around you. Now, that might sound extreme, but I also feel like that's kind of what the article was getting at, and that's kind of what it sounds like some people would prefer that the situation be on campuses, where it's like, hey, this is offensive to us, even though we know how it was intended, it's still offensive. So this event should be canceled. This class should be canceled. This course should be canceled. And is that, I mean, is that what a safe space should be on a college campus? To me, no, but I'd be curious to know your thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I guess I'm not really sure, because I think part of the bigger issue is we have not, the best I can tell, definitely not universally, answered what the purpose of college is.
Mm.
So that's probably the bigger issue. So everyone has an interpretation of what college should be and the purpose is and why you go. I personally, and you're right, it's just my opinion, I don't think college is actually supposed to be a safe space in this definition. It's supposed to be safe in that you should not be endangered physically, and it should be a place where you can go and you're there to learn, and that context geographically. But as far as you can't have differing opinions, I disagree with that. But I have no other basis other than that's my opinion, because I don't think that's the purpose of college, nor should it be. Other than you can have disagreements in a safe manner where you shouldn't feel that you would then, as I opened with earlier, those things will be compromised if I disagree with the popular opinion, sentiment, or otherwise. But there's a couple of things I wrote down while you were walking through that, and as I'm generally thinking about this. Number one, I think this particular conversation is also representative of, I feel, issues that have always been present and will always be present. And we're just more privy to it because a professor can get online and write an article, and then students, teachers, you, I, and across the board can respond. And that wasn't always the case. So I think we're just privy to issues that have always existed, because if you think about the dichotomy of what most college campuses are, the youngest professor, unless they're like an associate, might be in their 30s, but they tend to be in their 40s or 50s. And they're teaching to 20-year-olds, if not teenagers, 18, 19. I think I went to college when I was 19.
Yeah.
So just think about, beyond your parents, and probably even your parents, what other relationship do you have in your life where you're in some ways being forcibly taught information you may or may not agree with or may not buy in, and yet the other party has all the control on how they're going to grade you and score you, and they're talking at you or to you about the information in which you never had any friction. And so I think you can never escape from that. Like, college is inherently designed to have friction. And I think then it becomes a discussion of how do we interpret, implement, and navigate that friction. Because I do think part of the issue these days, and feeding into that, is we have less opportunities as a society to be apologetic and readily accepted. So it used to be, it's like a tree in a forest. You can make a mistake and either no one would know, or no one would care, or no one would hear. Whereas now you make a mistake, and even if you make a heartfelt apology for the mistake, you can still lose your job. You can still lose your friends. You can still lose there's much more quicker and severe repercussions for making mistakes. And I think we can all agree with that. Like,
yeah.
There was like teenagers on Twitter that like say something ignorant then there's a conversation. Well, should teenagers be ignorant, or should they be on Twitter? Yeah, but where are the parents? Like, you can have all these fucking conversations, but okay, I think we can reasonably all agree that teenagers make mistakes. But there's teenagers who make mistakes on Twitter now, and then everybody hops on their Facebook and starts emailing their employers and sending it to all their friends. So now their social network online and offline is affected. They've lost their job. Their first and last name is now associated with a search for them for the rest of their life. So they go on there, and that ignorant thing could potentially now haunt and cloud everything they do in perpetuity. And like that's like where we are right now. And something I wrote down here, for better or for worse, is one, and I'm going to open with, I know this metaphor is actually false, but it's actually very well known. If we're all getting worse, if society's getting worse, which is in itself probably subjective, or things that are younger better than older, older better than younger, we're all worsening together. Like, you know, whether we like this or not, we're in it together. It's kind of like the special thing. Well, if everyone's special, then is anyone really special? You know, if society broadly is getting worse, then is society really getting worse if we're all worsening together? And I'm reminded of the frog in the boiling water. Like, if society is the boiling water, or excuse me, actually society would be the frog, and what's happening around us is the boiling water, then by the time it got so bad where it would kill us or boil, we wouldn't know, because it's been rising slowly and we didn't hop out. So it's kind of like, metaphorically, whether we like it or not, we're all in this together. So for this teacher, and like I said earlier with us and millennials, for us to say, oh, millennials are idiots and millennials are this, that, and the other, as a millennial, in some ways doesn't make any sense, because it's like, well, you're only speaking about yourself. It's like if you're going to go all the way back to elementary school, it's like, I'm glue and you're rubber. Whatever you say bounces off me and sticks to you. Like, it's an inescapable intellectual conversation. So for a professor to say a lot of my students are representative of things I don't like, that's also reflective of you as a professor. And then it's also more broadly reflective of the university, which then might also, like on a macro micro scale, then be reflective of society. So to point your finger at society as if you are not a part of it is it's intellectually dishonest. But that's what a lot of people prefer to do. Like, let me step outside of all these things I'm going to point out that are wrong, as if I'm not a part of it, as if I don't have children that are this age, as if I don't know millennials or Generation X or whatever the representative population may be, or you are not one of them. And if you're not, I think there's another quote that I can't remember, I'll probably butcher. If you're not part of the solution, then there's an argument that you are part of the problem.
Yeah.
Or you are the problem.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing though, because that also goes into this like hypersensitive, cliquish, mobbish, where if I guess the majority or the loud minority says that something is a solution and you don't agree, then you're part of the problem. Despite the fact what you're saying could be completely reasonable and it comes from a good place. So I feel like that's in a way that quote, it almost makes the example for kind of part of what's being described here, or even kind of what I think it sounds like even what you were saying a little bit earlier, where, you know, you can be part of a conversation and people are raising hell about, I mean, we've seen this time and time again with social media where people are going nuts about something. And I'm not trying to dismiss what they're going nuts about, but I don't agree with the approach or with the angle that's being taken. And then because I don't agree, I'm now part of the problem. So it's almost like it goes back to that point of by virtue of having an opinion that doesn't conform to what other people believe is right, you're being told that you're wrong for not going along with what's the perceived norm, which to me is part of the problem, and something that I see more now than I've ever seen before, whether that be in school or just in social interactions in general, and even tying it back to what we said earlier about like, how do you have an opinion that doesn't offend people?
Yes. And I guess I would say that is all true, actually. But then I think we got to take a step back and, at least as a piece of it, look at the repercussions. And it almost goes back to, everything you need to know you learned in elementary school. And let's say you do something that the wider society doesn't agree with or no one agrees with. I would then say a starting point would be, what's the repercussion? Because, you got a kid that comes home and is like, Bobby doesn't like me. I'm like, well, fuck Bobby. And I'm like, well, what's the repercussion? Like, because some people are like, well, these people don't agree with me. And I'm like, okay. If there's there's a safe space, you are not harmed physically, mentally, or I guess you're harmed a little bit mentally. But if the only thing truly harmed is your feelings or your ego, I'm like, I don't know what to work with from there. Like it's almost, and maybe that's part of the issue here that I'm just like working my way to, is it almost feels like sometimes not only do we want people to agree with us, we also want to be compensated or resolved or aggrieved when people don't. Yeah. And it's like that's cake and eat it too. That's almost like the exact representation of that is, okay, if you go online and everyone disagrees with you, but you don't lose your job and no one's in your mentions abusing you and basically nothing happens, like no one retweeted you, my solution to that is either take your ass offline or so what? Like, I mean, nothing bad happened in that scenario other than people didn't agree with you.
That actually, in a weird way, makes a case for the internet being the safest place to be. I mean, and that's the thing. If nobody knows you, it's like what you said about the tree falling. I mean, you can go online, you can go into a chat room, you can go into a forum. Do people still go in the chat rooms? I'm sure there's like a roulette 2015. That shit is still crazy, by the way. Like you just land on like a chat. Anyway, but that's, you could make that case that if you're online, you're in these comment sections of these different websites. And that's why people see a lot of online communities as a safe space, even where there, could be a little bit of diversity in opinion. You can go in there, say something, and because it's not tied to your real name and your real identity, then there's not an offline repercussion or a tangible repercussion that's going to follow you back into your real life away from the computer.
In some ways, and we've talked jokingly and seriously about this, even as firsthand experience, the comment section, as much as I abhor it, is probably the most pure, and I mean an anonymous comment section, our forum or board, is actually probably the most purest representation of society that exists, because you're right. There is literally no other repercussion than your feelings or emotions or otherwise being hurt. Some people argue that, like, yeah, you can suffer post-traumatic stress and it can affect you mentally. But given that compared to what could happen on face-to-face interaction, I would say the comment section is probably the most purest form of human interaction. And I bring that up because the comment sections, when I mistakenly, and I try to avoid them with all my heart and soul these days, like, you can see people interacting there and they literally have nothing to lose and nothing to prove to one another. And yet it still devolves. Like there's people who will passionately argue all day long to complete strangers. And sometimes I wonder how they do it. Like you go on any site, but like I'll go on CNN, and we've talked about this. It does not matter what the article topic is about. And you go down to
Obama.
Yes, you go down to the comment section. Yes, exactly. Let's run with that. Fuck Obama. No, man, no. Fuck Bush. And then they go back and forth. Oh, well, he started the war. This will go on for hours. There'll be an entire thread of two complete strangers going back and forth. And I cannot describe in words how fascinating that is to me.
It is fascinating.
Complete. I mean, and that micro example is the internet, like the comment section. And that's how the internet started. When the internet started, it was really just one big comment section. And in some ways, it still is. I mean, we are people united or divided by any number of things. But at its basis nature, the internet's one big comment section.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, it's people flinging opinions left and right. people liking it, endorsing it, not endorsing it.
Grouping, niching, gaining support and losing support based on moderately to loosely to no informed opinions all the way up to facts.
Yeah. I feel like we got to like this like top of the mountain moment here. Like, it all makes sense. We just solved the Matrix.
I'm going to advocate, although you can do what you want, obviously, because that's the role that you have in this relationship. That should be the title of this week's episode. The internet is one big comment section.
I'm actually trying to write that down now. So, any other? Because I think, I think we've covered a wide range on this one, and I'd be curious to hear people's thoughts and opinions on this, and definitely encourage people to also read the article. But is there anything else that you'd flagged in your notes that you definitely wanted to cover on this front?
Not in my notes, and I would strongly advocate, I wanted to strongly encourage people to write in about this one, because this is one I'm actually curious about, because I remember in my exit interview, they were asking me about some things on at work, and I recognize this about myself, where I have learned over the years that I am not the best barometer for determining what is or is not an issue, because I have a really high bar for what I'll deem what is an issue, something I deem significant enough for me to get worked up about and then do something about or act upon. And I realize that bar is personally unfairly high when it comes to issues that may impact others. So, for example, it makes my life fairly easy because it takes a lot to bother me. It takes a lot for me to get upset. Now, when I finally get there, I stay there for a long ass fucking time. So I just try to avoid it. I'm like the Hulk. I talked about this before. I'm like, look, just don't make me angry. Like, you're not going to like me when I'm angry. I'm going to break some shit. I'm going to fuck some shit up. So let's just stay away from the angry place. And I was telling them that I learned that I usually have to poll people. And I reasonably go and I go talk to somebody. I talk to folks on each side of the spectrum. I talk to the angriest person in office. I'm like, hey, what do you think about this issue? Like, fuck that issue. I'm like, okay. I talk to the happiest person in office. I'm like, oh no, it's not that bad. And then I talk to some people in the middle. And then from there, I derive a final conclusion like, okay, this is an issue that actually does or does not need to be addressed. But a lot of people, and maybe that's what this professor is broadly talking about as far as critical thinking. Most people, the only thing they will ever need to validate their opinion is their opinion.
Yeah. I mean, and maybe a like or two here and there to make them feel good about themselves.
Most people don't even need that, because you have eggs on Twitter and they are literally talking to themselves. They have no followers. I've seen it. There's a timeline and it has 0 followers and they're just going off. And that fascinates me. Like I said, the internet is just one big comment section of like, this person has signed up to a platform to talk to themselves and document the conversation.
Yeah. Well,
it is essentially a journal.
Yep, that's exactly. It's well, Twitter is a micro journal for these people then, right? Where they just log on, spout off, and then go back into their eggshell, and like that's the end of it. So, yeah, I think this will. I imagine there'll probably be future discussion on this one. So we can end that there. I'm very much, like I said, very much interested in kind of seeing how other people respond to this. So definitely write in tgospodcast@gmail.com, or if you want to be anonymous, ask.fm/2guysonshow. Though if you write a lot, you have to spread it over multiple messages. And then you could also send us a message on Facebook as well. Feedback and follow up. So we're already deep into the depths of the show, and I know there were some things that I wanted to get to. And so we had a few responses about last week's episode. So that was side episode 21, where we talked about diversity and referring people and that whole challenge. And so we got a number of responses about that I'm going to hold, and we can revisit that next week. We also have a few listener questions in here as well that actually we will address on the next side episode for sure. So we'll make sure that we put aside the time to be able to cover these things. Was there anything from anyone that you had planned to cover that was in desperate need of covering that you think we can do quickly?
I think we have talked more than enough. I hope folks made it this far. This sounds like a 2-car ride podcast here.
Yeah. So if you have emailed us, we've received it. If you've emailed us and what you're dealing with is time sensitive, email us again because the email account is looking quite drowned right now. But we can hit the closeout. So we want to thank you for listening to the 22nd side episode. And just like I said on the main show, if you haven't visited the TGOS online store, you can do that by going to twoguys1show.com/store, where you'll find an assortment of T-shirts, bags, cups, and other TGOS paraphernalia. And if you go to that and you're like, a little bit too pricey for me right now, you do also have the option to donate to the show. So if you go to twoguys1show.com/show support, or if you just go to our website and look in the navigation menu, there's a button or a link that blatantly says donate. You can click that and donate on a recurring basis, or on a one-time basis at any amount. And we definitely encourage you to do that because we don't do the show for money, but there's no show without it. And there are a lot of things that we want to do to bring value to you as the listener that would be helpful to have some additional support on. So anything else from you before we wrap up?
I do not believe so. Good there.
Yeah. I feel like I'm walking away intellectually stimulated, man. Like I'm gonna go like do something on the couch, like sleep and then wake up and do something smart. But beyond that, I don't really know. And I guess I was thinking about so if someone does have an opinion and I don't agree, or I don't see where the issue is and I'm being called insensitive, I think I'm just going to start saying that I'm a critical thinker because that seems to be the answer. Like, you're insensitive. Like, no, I'm just thinking critically, damn it. And see how that goes over. Everywhere except at home in my relationship, though, because thinking critically there that can go ways that we don't like it to go.
I found logic to be the route less traveled.
So again, we want to thank everyone for listening. Until next week, be safe. We out. Peace.